Hello and welcome to episode 28 of the Scottish Liberty podcast with me, Antony Sammeroff, and my co-host.
A very scruffy looking Tom Laird today.
Yeah. It's the 29th of December 2016, so I hope you're looking forward to a very happy new year, and this will be our last show of the year. But we are joined by our first ever returning guest, Libertarian Scott, also known to some of you as Scotty M. And today we are going to talk about free market monopolies, that big spectre which freedom and liberty threatens us with. How are you today, Scott?
Yeah, things are very well. I mean, it's other than practically dying for the past week or so with the flu, but yeah, things are very well.
Good to hear it. So why don't you start, because we hear this is something that we hear a lot as free marketeers, and especially as advocates of a laissez-faire capitalist system where the government doesn't intervene in the economy. They say, well, that is just going to lead to corporations monopolizing the market, and they'll take over, and it'll be a private tyranny, much worse than anything you could expect under government.
This is from even people who are quite sympathetic normally to cree market ideas, who actually say this. It's not just from the left who hear this.
But yeah, and often stringently, it's a criticism of free market capitalism that very left-wing intellectuals like Noam Chomsky make. Oh, it would be a private tyranny. So will you start with telling us your view of what's wrong with this allegation that free markets lead to monopolies?
Well, I think it's first and foremost important to address what corporatism is. And the reason for that is because this is basically where the monopolies will stem from. It's all to do with the corporatist system. And people misinterpret, they misunderstand what the whole corporatist system's about. How often have you heard people say, well, it was deregulation that led to the things like the banking crisis, or they say deregulation leads to all these monopolies and things like that. And so it's important that people understand the corporatist system first and foremost, and of course the history relating. Now, when we talk about corporatism and what leads to the actual monopolies, it's big corporations that lobby the government, they pay off the politicians, and they get them, to lay on all these government regulations. The heavier and heavier the government regulations, the thousands of pages of regulations, the heavier it costs. The smaller businesses cannot consume these costs. It's too expensive for them. And the smaller businesses cannot afford to pay people to find loopholes in the regulations, whereas the big corporations can. And so corporatism is really all about the strong government regulation. It's all about, using government as a weapon against the smaller businesses. It weighs down all the smaller competition. And we can see that within the American healthcare system. Now, I mentioned before that I would go on and mention this because this is the perfect example of a monopolistic system. And in the American healthcare, they blame capitalism. They say, oh, it's a capitalist system of healthcare. It isn't. It's the absence of capitalism, the absence of the free market. And here's the prime example of what government did that ended up creating a monopolistic system in healthcare, which is why you've got about, it's about 50%, private sector, but it's still, government controlled. But here's the prime example. The American healthcare system it became monopolistic as a result of government granting a monopoly to the American Medical Association. It granted a monopoly to them to close down, basically, in the first 6 years, there's about 35 medical schools. And then between, you're saying, about 1910 to about the mid 1990s, there was a closure, you know, a roughly 168 medical schools closed down in total. Now, between that period, there was a vast increase of the US population. Now, if you've got a vast increase of the US population and you've got a closure of all these medical schools, it means there's going to be fewer medical doctors available on the market, but a higher demand for the medical treatment. And therefore, in relation to the laws of supply and demand, the costs are going to soar through the roof. Now, who's at fault for that? Well, it's the US government. It's the US government that granted the monopoly to close all these medical schools.
Right, and it's worth adding to that 19 states actually have a law that prohibits them from having more than one medical school. And the Association of American Medical Colleges warned that the USA could be short of 150,000 doctors by 2025 if training and graduation rates don't change.
Yes.
So you've got a massive restriction on the supply of doctors, and not everything a doctor does needs 7 years of training to accomplish, but you're not allowed to practice medicine without 7 years of training. So so there is a monopoly. The government's created a monopoly on doing those jobs where you have to jump through the appropriate hoops in order to be a doctor. But if clinics could train their own medical staff, then that would more resemble a free market, and the doctors who are highly qualified could hand off those jobs that are simpler to less well-trained staff on lower salaries and dramatically reduce the cost of healthcare. But please go on.
It's completely spot on. And in relation to the education, for example, obviously these students need to apply to become to become students to go on and learn to become medical doctors. And in the mid 1990s, it was, I think there was about, in 1996 there was about 40,000 or 44,000 applicants. I think only 16,000 got accepted. So there you have a problem where there's a lack of placements available, and due to the high demand of placements, there's going to be a very high cost in order to become a medical student. So all of these things, and that's all stemmed from government that's created this monopolistic system. And it's the same with regards to what I was talking about with regards to corporatism being about heavy government regulation, because what the US government did was it strongly regulated the private sector, and therefore, again, this forced the closure of many of the smaller hospitals. The smaller hospitals could not, consume the costs. And therefore, what you're faced with is giant hospitals that essentially have gained a monopoly over the healthcare market, and the fewer hospitals, and the higher demand, the higher the cost. And even with regards to the last but not least, a third-party payer system. Now, a third-party payer system means that someone else other than the consumer is more or less determining the cost. There's the lack of competition, the lack of capitalism. Therefore, this monopolistic system means that due to the government being the third party, it determines the cost, and the consumer can't shop around.
And even then, there's all sorts of laws saying you can't buy insurance by a company that's not based in your own state. So even then, but let's go back in history a little bit. What about these rumors that we hear about companies like Standard Oil, who had a monopoly, a near monopoly on the provision of oil, and weren't they making an absolute fortune because they had a stronghold in that industry?
Well, here's the thing. I mean, Standard Oil is probably the most famous example. They love to try and claim that Standard Oil held this monopoly over the market, and they never. The fact of the matter was, they entered the market in 1863. Yes, Standard Oil became dominant by 1869, but they never became dominant through any sort of predatory pricing like people try to claim, because the whole story and claim that they used predatory pricing to dominate, this was during the 1870s, it said. This wasn't the case. Because the whole thing with Standard Oil, John Davis and Rockefeller was far more efficient than his competitors. And it's one of the reasons why he became so dominant in that area. Because the fact that he did many things that, mean his business would save so much more, and he became rich off of it. A prime example was how he changed the barrels that contained the oil to transport. He even changed the transport routes with regards to the railroad industry and everything. All of these things that would cut time, save the railroad industry money, as well, of course, gain and reap massive profits for themselves. But here's the thing. In 1869, it would cost more than 30 cents per barrel of oil, right? More than 30 cents per barrel of oil in 1869. 2 years later, by 1871, when they gained 4% share of the market, Standard Oil, well, it would soon cost, 22 cents per barrel of oil. By 1879, they gained 90% share of the market. Now, people might say, well, hold on a second here, Scott. 90% share of the market. Surely to Christ, they owned a monopoly. Well, the fact of the matter is, they never. A monopoly means they would hold 100% share of the market. They wouldn't have any competition there at all. And, of course, another thing is the very fact that, well, with no competition, surely with the predatory pricing, they would just jack their prices up, shaft the consumer, and this is what people believe. However, the problem with that argument is the very fact that when in 1879 they gained 90% share of the market, well, by 1897, the cost of a barrel of oil kept on dropping. Even after gaining 90% share of the market, the cost of a barrel of oil kept on dropping, so much so that, as I said, originally it would cost more than 30 cents per barrel of oil. By 1897, it would only cost 5.9 cents per barrel of oil, and that's because there was competition on his back. And who was that competition?
So even though go on.
Who was the competition? Well, he had several competitors, but one of his main competitors in the 1870s was the producer and seller of the electric light bulb. I mean, come on. If your business heavily relies upon selling kerosene, how the hell are you supposed to compete against someone who is producing and selling an electric light bulb? I mean, look around you, look around every house, every building. Are they lit by kerosene? No, of course not. It's a lot more dangerous, and at the end of the day, everywhere now is lit by the electric light bulb, and so there is no way he would be able to keep his costs high, because he would be up against fierce competition with the producer and seller of the electric light bulb.
Yes, and I've heard also he pioneered creating all the byproducts like plastic that we get out of oil. So yes, he did become very rich, but he became very rich by improving people's standards of living immeasurably, by the sounds of it, by bringing down the price of oil, by creating industrial processes that made oil cheaper. He actually massively improved people's standards of living. And So what?
Just quickly, is it true? Do you know if there's any truth? I mean, they say that he actually probably saved the whale. Because with kerosene, up until then, people were actually burning whale oil, and when that when the kerosene was cheaper, people switched from whale oil to kerosene, and didn't hunt whales as much. I mean, I don't know if that's true, but
that's spot on. That is spot on, and that's precisely one of the benefits of his massive business. Plus the fact he was the one who, due to his business, he opened the door to Henry Ford's automobile industry. That was massive change, in, especially with how a country was lit, and it's just incredible that he.
And I think it's worth mentioning that these guys did these things not because they had basically a burning desire to light people's houses, or Henry Ford because he wanted to see people running about in cars, but they spotted an opportunity to make money, filthy lucre, and through doing that, it's generally the people who set out to make profit who do more good than people who set out to do good.
Yeah,
that's the thing, because they say
when people set out to do good, they start trying to manage and regulate other people and tell other people what to do. But it's innovators that do a lot of the good in the world. I mean, you've got whoever invented the memory stick saved more trees than your average environmentalist. And then, now they've got these toilets that basically evaporate all your waste and use it for energy. And they're quite a new invention, but they'll soon be really, really helping over in the third world. I mean, those probably would have been invented in the 70s or something like that, if not for the government monopoly on municipal water. Yeah. So when the government says, oh, we can't let the free market provide X, like municipal water, it actually has massively stifled innovation in that industry. So only now are people inventing environmentally friendly toilets that don't mean that all your waste needs to get taken miles and miles away out of the city to a sewage plant, but actually the chemicals in it can be used as fertilizer and so forth. But so what about some of these other robber barons that we've heard of, like Andrew Carnegie and so forth? And there is an excellent book. Well, I've not read the book, but I've heard the author speaking on YouTube, Bert Folsom, and he wrote a book called The Myth of the Robber Barons, for anyone who wants to look that up. Either he's a great speaker, but also I hear his book's very good. Would you like to tell us some more of the other robber barons that we've been told were greedy monopolists?
Well, I couldn't tell you too much about Andrew Carnegie specifically, but I know that there's a lot of them out there where they do feed out a lot of these myths in that time period, especially the robber barons and stuff like that. One of the most famous ones, I don't know if you've ever heard of, it was a diamond company. It was the
Beers.
The Beers Group, and that's a prime example. You take
the Oppenheimer then. The Oppenheimer,
and the De Beers Group gained a near perfect monopoly, and yet it gained that simply due to, well, government's nationalisation, and that was a prime example, because you go back to the whole thing on Standard Oil, a monopoly in that area didn't come about until the company was broken up by government, and government's interference has always been the perpetrator behind what's led to the monopolies rather than the market itself, and that's one of the things that I can definitely.
Yeah, I mean, we hear that we need these regulations to protect us from monopolies, but if you actually understand what a regulation is, it's hard to avoid the conclusion that by its very nature, every regulation is going to make an industry more monopolized, because every regulation says you can't operate within these parameters, and the next one says within these parameters, and then within these parameters. So every regulation, it's got, as you said, it's got a price of compliance. You need to be able to pay for lawyers and accountants and bureaucrats and lobbyists. But even so, if we say, okay, you're only allowed to produce shoes that aren't blue. Okay, it might be ridiculous, but whatever it is, you're saying that fewer people are allowed to industry. Now, so if we Mr.
Sammeroff's lost the plot.
I seem to have lost the plot. Please take a
yeah.
I'm just saying that you're basically, the more regulations there are, the more you regulate mum and dad businesses right out of the market, and that makes it difficult for new startups to enter into production in any sector. But I also want to attack the idea that the big business will always be dominant, because if you see that big business, right, tanker, right, and it might produce products for a mass market, and it might be very good at that. But if people's needs and things like that change, it's very difficult to turn around a big oil tanker. Whereas you can have on a free market, that might have 100 small competitors, which chip away at its market here. Oh, we're the one that makes the blue shoes, let's say. They customize their products to niches. Rather than selling to a mass market, small businesses are flexible. They can get on their phone to their customers, they can get on the phone to their suppliers, and they can meet individual needs in a way that's very hard for a big business to do. So the big business isn't always going to be king. And also,
it's only a matter of time.
If the big business has its hands in many, many pies, then it becomes very bureaucratic and difficult for the people running the business to look at everything that's going on. So maybe if it's serving its customers well, it will stay a big business. If it's not, all these tiny little competitors can chip away at it until it loses market share.
What they can do, surely, just to give a counterpoint here, is surely they can just buy out.
I'm so glad
all these smaller companies like Sony. I mean, there's lots of different music companies out there, but if you look behind them, you find a lot of them belong to Sony. Right. So it's all part of the same machine.
This is the thing where the whole argument is the fact they say, oh, they'll just buy out all the rest of the companies. The fact of the matter is, it becomes more and more expensive for them to do so, and a fierce.
And at least they have to use their own money to do that.
Yep. And in a fiercely competitive free market, I mean, competition is always coming through, and it's very fierce. Yes. And the whole issue, and I want to go back to a wee point you were saying about the regulation, because this is actually what creates the monopolies for big businesses, is destroying innovation. And something I spoke about earlier was in relation to do with quantity and quality controls. People need to understand that when governments set down these regulations, such as the quantity and quality controls, it is dictating and determining how much businesses can produce, what businesses can produce, because you're limiting businesses to government strict rules over the type of produce that's going to be available in the market, and that's what hinders innovation. Now, in a free market, as I was saying, it's fiercely competitive. It has a strong innovation within the market, so you're always going to have people coming through and competing against these big businesses, and they always use that one that Tam was saying about well, what if this company comes in and just buys them all out and all the rest of it. It eventually it leads to their own demise, and there's always going to competition comes through.
I'd like to add to that. So first of all, it's bad to assume that a big company buying up a small company is actually a bad thing. Supposing you have a small company here and there's a dominant product on the market, like say a small company comes out and buys designs a better microphone than the one that we are using. Well, they don't
surely not.
they don't necessarily have the distribution that a big company has. So if their product really is better and a big company comes in and buys them out, that is absolutely great for the consumer, because they will be able to distribute that product far and wide, much further than that smaller company could have. And the price of the product might actually even go down in the short term.
Mm-hmm.
The second thing is, if it's not in the public interest, well, the company needs to find the funds to buy up its competitors. And every time it does that, well, that's some amount of money that's not there to invest internally, or to pay the shareholders, or to pay their staff. So they're actually making themselves uncompetitive each time they buy up a competitor. If they need to go to the bank for a loan, they're going to have to put interest in that loan.
Mm-hmm.
And the more strict the patent laws are, which are of course created by government, the more easily it's going to be for these big companies to control the industry. In fact, you get these people called patent trolls who just, instead of creating anything productive, instead of creating anything useful, they just buy up patents. And then if anyone creates a product that's anything similar to their patent, they just sue the person. Now, that is not a product of the free market, but it is very monopolistic, and it shows again that, contrary to what the left believe, government does not regulate the excesses of capitalism. Government creates the excesses of capitalism.
An interesting point, because it goes back to Standard Oil on that, is the fact that you find that a company can buy out other competitors, right? And Standard Oil had set about and doing that, but they agreed to basically work with Standard Oil, and the reason why is because it relates to the fact that, well, they knew he was far more competitive. He was far more, shall I say, he was far more competent is the key word. And because they knew he was more competent, and their businesses were in demise in the 1870s, they knew that working with someone who was as genius as himself, they would reap the benefits and the rewards, and they did. They reaped massive rewards through working for Standard Oil, and it was massively successful until government stepped in. But the point being is the fact that it's not always a negative thing to see, as you're saying, that businesses will step in, because see, here's a prime example. If you have incompetency and they're bought over by a bigger company, that bigger company can take that company on, can take the assets and everything, can take on whatever it is, and basically make it competent, you know what I mean? And teach that whoever it was that failed in business, can teach them, better business practice for them to be, better in business. But I mean, I think people's main fear out of all of that is the fact that, well, it could end up creating a monopoly, but it's not the case. You will find competition does come through as a result of the lack of government regulation, and that's always been the case in history. It's always been down to the fact that government's interference is what creates the monopolies through government regulation, and people seem to think that's the solution to the problem when it's actually the cause of the problem.
Well, a more up to date thing would be, people would say, well, look at what happened in the Soviet Union. You had a big government that got broken up, a big entity that got broken up, and the market pretty much had free reign in the first stages of that, and it created the oligarchs, and through the oligarchs came these giant, Russian monopolies. What would you say to that one?
Exactly. I mean,
that's kind of where the left are coming from in that one.
It's remarkable how the left can even come to such a conclusion when we know that the Soviet Union itself was going from dictatorship right to complete totalitarianism. It was anything but anything remotely close to anything free market. It was even even from the claim about, because they call this state capitalism, and I don't know how many times you've probably heard the name yourself. All state capitalism is
it's the
basically
next
socialism that's in practice. It can't get rid of the private sector 100%, but yeah, that's basically it. So that's why you
Well,
have...
that's the new one. You know, they have to defend socialism as an ideology. So whenever it fails, they just say, well, that wasn't real socialism. That the Soviet Union was state capitalism. Of course, what they mean by that is socialism means whatever we like. Capitalism is whatever we don't like. And we didn't like that. So it can't possibly be socialism. Only what we like is socialism. Capitalism, that's why they always confuse the influence of the state and the market. In our society, everything good that happens is obviously because of government. Everything that bad happens, even if it's caused by government, is capitalism. You know, you know, the environment isn't protected. Okay, well, that's a product of capitalism. Even though you yourself say the government's responsible for enforcing regulations on the market, you know, on the environment, right? Look, there's wars. The government taxes people at gunpoint to pay for wars. Oh, it's capitalism that's causing the wars. How is it capitalism? Did Coca-Cola pay for the war? Did McDonald's pay for the war? Right? If they want, if the big boys, if the big businesses are the real problem, why doesn't Microsoft lobby Starbucks? Starbucks and Microsoft lobby the government. Because the government are the ones with the guns. The government are the ones that are able to give them privileges that create a monopoly structure or a monopoly-like structure. And what do you think about the fact that, before you go on, and what do you think about the fact that people seem to have no similar skepticism about government monopolies? You know, they might say that the government should nationalize the government should nationalize the railways. I've heard people say that.
I mean, this is the thing, because I was actually just going to go on and speak about something very, very similar in relation to do with government. They seem to think, oh, well, it's okay for government to hold a monopoly. Oh, really? Like, here's the problem with that, with their view on this, right? They're always very quick to point the finger at the private sector and say, here's a fault with the private sector. Prime example, BP, that caused a massive oil spill, right, in the Gulf of Mexico. Now, the difference is, BP, as the private sector will, they paid for their damages, right? They paid for their damages. Whereas when government owns a monopoly, such as the government ownership of, you know, the oil industry in Mexico, the government-owned oil company in Mexico caused a massive spill in the Gulf of Mexico, but government took no accountability for its actions, and yet there it was, didn't even pay for
but we can vote them out, though. At least we can vote governments out.
But that's the thing, because they're always, it's always this case where, okay, what we'll do is we'll vote them out and we'll bring in the new thing, and it's a repeat cycle. It's and that's the thing.
Voting isn't nearly as much of a say as your choice of what you buy. I mean, see if I don't like Starbucks, I don't have to lobby. I don't have to get 51% of the electorate to agree with me. I don't have to write letters to officials. I just go across the road to Costa or to the local place. Whereas with government, you have to lobby, you have to write letters, you need to mobilize public support. So when the government takes monopoly over any industry, that is the biggest, most dangerous thing that can happen. Because if you don't like what you're getting, you'll have zero say whatsoever. You don't have alternatives.
Here's the thing, Antony, in relation to government and the monopoly, and one you just recently mentioned was about for example, the British NHS. Now, and this is a massive, massive problem. People seem to just brush failure under the carpet like it doesn't exist, because it's easy enough for them just to say, well, here's government, government will be our provider, and that's been the case ever since 1948. We've had this government ownership over healthcare, and yet, instead of actually accepting its poor quality, instead of accepting the massive, big, long waiting lines, all of these things get excused. On one hand, when it comes to, you know, not speaking about healthcare, they will complain, and they'll complain about certain things. But when it comes to someone attacking the NHS, they'll be quick to defend government's ownership of it, because they try, well, like I say, they try to link to American healthcare and say how that's capitalist when it's not. But the point being here is the fact that with regards to the NHS and government's monopoly over the healthcare system, what you have is a healthcare system faced with the economic calculation problem, and regardless of how poor it becomes, how substandard it is, regardless of people's lives at risk on it, they'll completely brush it under the carpet, because to them, government's ownership over it, socialism is more important than, you know, people's
Yes.
own lives at risk in that.
And on the face of it, they'll say, well, you know, we can't put money before people's lives and things like that. But if you look at data from the government, it shows a stay in an NHS hospital costs the government around £400 per day, whereas a typical private healthcare stay, even in this country where we have a highly regulated private market, is around £275 per night, which is a clear £125 difference. That is people's lives. That money,
yes,
that saving in resources are the resources that we need to save lives. It's not just about money.
Yeah.
And when you look at the fact that there's 1 million people on NHS waiting lists, those are lives. Those are lives at stake. We do not have universal healthcare. And anytime anyone says we have universal healthcare, people need to say, no, we have rationing. At the moment, we have rationing.
Yeah, things have changed over time. I would say
even if you want to keep the NHS, the only sane thing to do is completely deregulate the private sector in healthcare, because then we won't have these big waiting lists, we won't have shortages of medical practitioners, and all the innovations that are happening in the private sector will teach the public sector how to operate better. I mean, the American healthcare system is far from perfect. It's a terrible system in many, many ways, but most of the best medical technology in the world comes out of America. So countries like Denmark, who have free healthcare, actually benefit from technology invented in America. Although I do fear that we stray off topic.
Slightly. All I wanted to cover just quickly there was, you mentioned something in your last monologue there, Scotty. You mentioned the economic calculation problem. Just for anybody who's listening and hasn't heard that terminology before, could you give us a quick explanation of the economic calculation problem?
Just a quick explanation of the economic calculation problem. It's basically in relation to do with prices. Nothing in economics is more important than the information of prices. From the information of prices, we get the information of profits and losses, the two most important pieces of information that tells the market, as prices are signals. The profits tell the market, you know, what to produce more of, how much to produce, where to allocate scarce resources, what to invest more in. Losses tell the market what to stop producing, what to stop investing in, where to stop allocating scarce resources. And so basically what the economic calculation problem means is that because socialism distorts the information of profits and losses through artificially raising and lowering costs above or below market value. Market value, of course, meaning consumers' demand, but basically, when government destroys that information of profits and losses, it no longer holds all of that information of profits and losses, and therefore it causes what we call the misallocation of scarce resources. And this is what happens when government gains a monopoly.
Yeah.
Government's monopoly ends up distorting information of prices. And one thing governments and socialism doesn't accept, it does not accept higher prices in the market. And every time it tries to artificially drive the cost down, the underlying reality of scarcity doesn't go anywhere. It's all well artificially driving a cost down, but that high price in the market was telling the market, here is where there's a scarcity, and therefore trying to drive the cost down is really just going to cause an even bigger problem. And that's the problem with government's monopoly in that area.
Yeah,
and it's
because you're going to end up with a lack of provision where service providers actually can't give those services at the lowered price. But what's more is that they don't realize that those high prices are actually an indication to producers to come into that industry to take advantage of high prices. So if you succeed in knocking the price down, you've just told a whole bunch of producers, oh, don't produce this, don't produce this, do not cater to the existing demand for this because the price is too low. And no individual can calculate that. You need that information of buyers and sellers to tell people what they need and don't need, which is why under socialism you always have massive shortages of some things and the complete wasteful overproduction of other things.
And this is the thing, because shortages are largely caused by government's price ceilings and things like that, and of course the price floors is what causes the surplus waste. But here's, like mentioned earlier about the rails, the railway. I mean, take for example, if you look at what's left within the let's just say, if you were to go from Glasgow to London, for example, or anywhere, you'll see that it's completely dominated by Virgin. There's a lack of competition. And it's government itself that's always the cause of the problem. It's creating monopolies, and the economic calculation problem plays into absolutely everything. It plays into the rails, the railway.
Yeah.
It plays into everything to do with the inefficiency of healthcare. It plays into everything, and another
electricity.
Another thing I'd like to just quickly add is that, for example, that you're saying about the high prices, what a high price can also say to the consumers, it can say to the consumers, here's where they may be incentivized to stop spending. Why? Because there's a shortage, and therefore it can incentivize them to buy an alternative, and that can be a very good thing in the market.
Yeah.
And all this efficiency stems from the information of profits and losses through the market-driven prices. And if you destroy that information, it doesn't matter whether you want to talk about railway or healthcare or anything involving government, socialism just leads to complete inefficiency, waste. And
it's very hard to actually draw borders around what's one industry and what's another industry. I mean, can you have a monopoly on rail, or would it have to be a monopoly on transport? I mean, on a free market, if supposing Virgin had a monopoly on rails, right? The government decided to privatize it and Virgin buy them all up. Well, they still can't put the prices up too high, because on a free market, anyone can just buy a bus or a people carrier and just accept money from taking people to A to B. If the prices are too high, then people will just do that more and more and more. And you've got planes, and then someone might build an underground bullet train, riverboats. And it's the same with, once upon a time, if you had all the telephone companies, and BT had a virtual or even monopoly on the provision of telephones, I'm sure people.
Well, they kind of still do, because you can't. The lines themselves are owned by by one company.
Right, I see, and that's of course the product of government. And if you do go and research Bert Folsom's writings, he talks about how all those things were done without monopolies for a short time, and it was seemed to be working pretty well before the government said, oh no, we need to take that over and have the only phone lines. But now, even if you had all the phone lines, you can't say that you have a monopoly on communication technology, because we now have the internet, we have Skype and things like that. So the whole point of the market is that may many flowers bloom, and people will always be looking for ways to innovate and bring new products to get around service provision, which will force companies and other lines of providing that service to improve.
Well, a great example of like in relation to what you're talking about was Hong Kong. All these oligopolies, etc., all of these things that have been, you know, propping up in certain so-called monopolies, all of these actually stemmed as a result of government's land ownership and government leasing the property. That was primarily the reason why there was a lack of competition. You've got to remember the size of Hong Kong. It's a very tiny, small spit of land. And yet it was like, in relation to what you're talking about there, government's land ownership and leasing of the property is primarily the reason for why there was the lack of competition and what created the very style of monopolistic, it's a tiny small harbour, it's like the size of nothing, but in relation to Hong Kong, what you're speaking about there is something that, again, government is the cause of that. And it's there's very few examples of where you could look at where government has, you know, been out the way and the market has proven better off. A great example, and I like to look at in terms of transportation, was the country Chile. Chile, you know, began, I don't know how true it was, but Chile apparently had began the privatization on things like water, even on transportation. And yet the costs of, for example, the costs of their transport was a lot cheaper. And even with regards to how, you know, well, I don't know the full story behind the water and that, but apparently it was a lot more competitive. Again, that's something that maybe you could touch upon in terms of about the Chile, in terms of the private water. But I mean,
well, what gets me is that when people talk about this kind of thing, and they say, well, look, if this is really what's going to happen, you know, in the left's view, you know, you're just going to get a corporatist system, and the corporations and the big companies are going to reign supreme, and these oligarchs are going to reign supreme. Why then are they not fine? I mean, where's, right, I'm for people who don't, I'm leader of the Scottish Libertarian Party. Where's my check from Halliburton, right? Where is the money rolling in for Starbucks?
For free marketeers.
For free marketeers, because you'd think they'd go, wow, right, that's what we need there. We need guys that are going to deregulate everything, plough money, stop giving money to the Conservative Party, stop giving money to the Labour Party, plough all our money into the Scottish Libertarian Party because they're going to deregulate. That does not happen. And people go, well, you're not big enough. You know, if you were big enough, they would do that. Well, tell you what, make us big enough then, if that's really what they think.
And they own the media. Do you know what I mean? You hear all these, oh, government monopoly on this, government's, you know, sorry, rather not government. This corporation's bad, that corporation's bad, this one's dodging their taxes, that one's dodging their taxes, all the time on the media. You'd think that the media would be plowing out free markets, deregulate. You'd think that there would be documentaries on the BBC about the
extolling the virtues of the free market
and about the socialist calculation problem for dummies. You know, you'd think that Ludwig von Mises would be being taught at university to even economic students, which he rarely ever is. Everyone has heard of Karl Marx in university, but no one's heard of Karl Menger. And for those of you who haven't heard of Karl Menger, you'll just have to look him up. Have you got anything to add, really, either of you, before we wrap up the show today?
No, I think that shot my bolt there with that my final gambit there.
Yeah.
Please don't shoot your bolt live on the air.
It might put our viewing figures up. I doubt it very much. But yeah.
I think at the end of the day, you're absolutely spot on. I mean, this whole monopoly over the media and everything.
Again, government.
And it's why people have lost faith in the whole thing, especially the BBC. I mean, this is why the BBC needs to be privatised, because it needs to be, put it this way, for the content that it provides, it really should be providing for what people are going to watch, what people want to watch, right? And the very issue with regards to government ownership over things like the media, and you look at the BBC, is the fact that it starts to go on the path of its own. And let's be brutally honest here. The BBC has been abusive to even people on the left. It's been abusive to people in general in the country. It's very.
It helps sell the wars.
Exactly. Yeah. I mean, it propagates everything in favour of the establishment. A prime example was its, support of the European Union, but that's because the European Union, that's where they get a large bit of their funding. So this is why you need to take that monopoly, you need to take it out of the hands of government, privatise it, make it competitive, make it work for its money. And the only way it's going to work for its money is by providing a service to what people are going to voluntarily pay for, not through this government monopolistic system.
Well, I mean, the thing is, just quickly with the BBC as well, I mean, people, certainly probably in my generation, have got this kind of avuncular view of, not avuncular, but it's the anti-Beeb, and it's kind of, it's all very cosy. And they don't realise that the corporation has actually changed over time, and most of the stuff that the BBC puts out now is actually done by outside production companies anyway. It's not, there's not, you can't open a door and there's a room full of people all writing comedy, and there's another room, but well, there was it one. Queen Margaret Drive was terrible for it, but yeah, it's actually outside production companies working on a private level who then make a fully integrated, complete product and then take it to the BBC and sell it to them. So it's not as if the BBC are actually producing this stuff itself. It's outside production companies. So it's all they have really is a monopoly on force to collect your license fee off you and force you to pay for your product, whether you watch their product or not. And they're talking.
That's the real monopoly.
Just as a word of warning as well, they were talking about abolishing the TV license, but then what they were talking about bringing in was a German or Swedish style media tax. They don't call it a tax; they'll call it something, a media contribution or something like that. But it's basically going to be a tax. So whether you've even got a television or not, you'll be liable to pay that media tax. And what they'll say to you is, well, if you don't watch it, that's your fault. You should be availing yourself of it because you pay for it. So that's going to be even worse, and that's what they're talking about doing. So, and then that's a monopoly. That's a government monopoly.
Yes. So don't forget, there's only one organisation that has the monopoly on the use of force, and that is the government. So once you grant people that power, and they'll say, well, the BBC produces a better standard of shows, and I used to kind of be for the BBC a little bit more. I found it quite hard to be for privatising it because I'm an intellectual, and I thought they were more intelligent
Public
sometimes.
Service broadcasting.
But why is everyone so dumb? It's because the government has a monopoly on the education system, and they put you through 11 to 13 years of education where you come out the other end, can't even get a job that will pay you £10 an hour. So if you look at
example of that, because if
you look at the look at the industries in society at the moment. Instead of having this theory in your head that free markets create monopolies, look at the areas of society where the government interferes the least. I bet you will find the least amount of monopolization, and the areas of society where government intervenes the most, you will find the most monopolisation.
So you were away to say there, Scotty, about Scotland?
I completely agree. I mean, the whole thing with regards to Scotland, it's a perfect example of the state education, and it's unfortunate as it is. It's turned a very what used to be and I remember watching the documentary and the old woman saying that long gone are the days of Scotland where people used to stand on their own 2 feet and everything, and it's you would blame the state educational system that's created a very dependent class of people.
Absolutely.
Where everything is just handouts, free this. And I recently posted and shared something in the BBC, something Scottish called The Social. And a great example of this is the fact that this lassie is wanting to force taxpayers to pay for the sanitary towels and all the rest of this so that they get it so-called free. Now, it's forcing people who are never personally ever going to need it and pay for these things, pay for other. But the point being is the fact that the state educational system has more or less, and I hate to say it, but it's the truth, but it's dumbed society down and created this leftist dependent class where government's the server and provider, and you've seen a change from what used to be the Scotland of the 19th century, where the country would be able to stand on its own 2 feet, be creative, be innovative, and now it's become a country where, unfortunate as it is, too many people have got into the mindset where government should be the provider of this and a provider of that, and whether it's state pensions or state healthcare or state roads.
Well, luckily, we are the fight back, and we're also giving free education as a counterbalance to the government monopoly on education. So thank you so much for coming on our show a second time.
Thanks to Chip Murray for joining. Oh, sorry, Scotty.
And thanks for availing us of your knowledge of history and economics, and perhaps see you again in the new year.
Yeah, have a good new year.
Same to yourselves. Thank you.
Good new year to all you out there, and throughout the bells and into 2017, be libertarians. Don't be a lefty or a righty.